Tom and I were out of town, but it's good to see the place is still standing when we made it back, so that's good. So let me ask you, do y'all know who the bad kids are at your school? You know, the ones that are always getting into trouble, the ones vaping in the bathroom, maybe they're cut class, the ones cussing and telling raunchy jokes on the bus. You might have even had a couple of run-ins with these bad kids. Maybe you've been made fun of them, been made fun of by them. And you might have reacted to them honestly, like I did when I was your age and I was in school. I tended to look down on them, right? Because they were the bad kids. I thought they were idiots, you know? I thought that, everything I did was better than what they were doing. And I would get this feeling of satisfaction when I'd see them get in trouble or get a bad grade. Or maybe you're here tonight and you feel like you are one of the bad kids, right? And you're feeling the shame of that and the pain of the condescending looks that you've gotten from the good kids. So there was a time in Jesus' life and his ministry here on earth when he had a run-in with the bad kids. In Luke 9, Jesus and his disciples, they're on their way to Jerusalem, and they were about to go through this Samaritan village. And if you've been around church a bit, you may have heard that the Jews and the Samaritans, they don't get along, right? The Samaritans were like the bad kids, right? They were Jews who had turned their back on traditional Judaism. And when the Samaritans heard that Jesus was trying to go through their town on his way to Jerusalem, they blocked the road and made him take a detour around their whole city. They wouldn't let him come in because of how much they hated the Jews. And two of Jesus' disciples, two of his closest disciples, the brothers James and John, they see this and they're like, how dare you treat Jesus like this? And they're like, well, let's look at it. Let's look at it. In Luke 9, verse 54, let's look at what they say. So in verse 54, when the disciples James and John saw this, they asked Jesus, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them? It's maybe a little bit over the top, but that's how mad they were. But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went to another village. So while James and John were thinking that these guys need to be destroyed for how they've mistreated Jesus, not letting him come through their city, to their surprise, Jesus is much, much more upset with the attitudes of James and John than the way that he was rejected by these Samaritans. So this, I think, really shows us something about following Jesus. We're in this series where we're trying to think about how are we going to live as he did and what would Jesus do. We need to see tonight how Jesus would respond to the lost, how you would treat lost people. That's what we're going to be answering tonight. What would Jesus do when he encounters sinners? Well, one incident in the Bible that really stands out and shows a stark contrast between the good way, how Jesus would react to sinners versus how the Jewish religious leaders would react. It's in the 8th chapter of John's Gospel. And I actually found out that last week while we were gone, at least the high school girls talked about this passage. So, it's good to read it again. But for the rest of us who didn't study it, let's look at this tonight. So in John chapter 8, verse 2, read along with me on the screen. It says, at dawn, he, this is Jesus, appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him. And he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. And they made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses, it commanded us to stone such women. So that's literally, they would take big stones and throw them at people until they died. That's what stoning means. Now, what do you say? And in verse 6, it tells us they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. So in this passage, let's first look at the bad example of a reaction to sinners by the Pharisees. The Pharisees are the top religious leaders of the day. They're the most pious, the most religious, most strict rule followers there were. In addition to very closely following all the laws that were given to all the people in the Old Testament, the Pharisees taught that you should even follow all of the regulations that are in the law, which were given only for the priests to follow while they were ministering in the temple. But they said, we all should follow it because we all should be acting that holy. And then on top of this, they added all of their own man-made, made-up rules on exactly how you should go about following the rules that were in the law. And as a result of all this rule following then, they were super self-righteous. They were always comparing themselves with others to see just how much better they were at following the law. Because they thought that was how they were getting to heaven, by their own works, by their own heritage. So that's this group. And we see in verse 6, this whole setup, this whole thing happened as a setup with the goal of trapping Jesus in his words in front of the people. Because you see, the Pharisees, they actually didn't care anything about this woman, right? It was clear they didn't even see her as a person. She was just a tool that they were using, right? And they dragged her out into this into the temple court, the most crowded area that there was in Jerusalem. And the wording in the original Greek in verse 3 states that the woman was caught in the act of adultery. That literally means, it reads that she was caught in the act of actually having sex with someone who wasn't her husband. They saw it happening, right? And according to the law in the Old Testament as it was written, they had to actually see the act of adultery happening in order for stoning to be on the table. And that would almost be impossible, right? Because people go off and, not in public and do these things. So that would almost be impossible unless this was a setup from the beginning. So it's clear many commentators think that these religious leaders must have set this up as an entrapment, tempting this woman into this sin. Also, the law actually puts most of the blame for adultery on the man rather than on the woman. Yet nothing is mentioned of a man here, right? He must have been caught too, but they only brought the woman in. So it shows that these religious leaders, they actually care nothing about really following the law or the spirit behind the law. All that mattered to them was that they could use this woman as a way to make themselves look better than Jesus in front of the people. So let's read on then and see Jesus' reaction. All right, so in the end of verse 6, but Jesus bit down and started to write on the ground with his finger. So this is always like one of the craziest thing that you see Jesus do in the Bible. In the middle of being publicly questioned by the top religious leaders in the crowded temple court, there's a woman standing in shame in the middle of this huge crowd. She was probably barely clothed. Maybe she just was wrapped up in a blanket or something because they pulled her directly from the act of adultery. And what does Jesus do? He bends down and starts doodling on the ground. So if in this series, if you're looking for the answer to what would Jesus do, you can put right on the ground like a weirdo, So no, just kidding. But one of the things we need to think about is, why would Jesus do this? It's weird. Well, think of it this way. Everyone is staring at this woman, knowing what she's done, pointing at her, demanding that Jesus pronounce punishment, judgment on her. And by stooping down then, writing on the ground like a crazy person, ignoring that people were even asking him a question, Jesus successfully takes the focus of the crowd off of this woman and puts it on himself. You see, because unlike the Pharisees, Jesus actually cared very, very deeply about this woman as a person. All right, let's read on then and see what happens next. What happens after he writes on the ground? Verse 7. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And then he goes back to writing on the ground again. So after removing the focus of the crowd from the shame of the woman, Jesus finally addresses the Pharisees, addresses their question. And look at what he does. He doesn't dispute the facts of the case. There's no question about whether she was guilty or not, right? They had literally caught her in the act. And there was no question about whether adultery is wrong or not according to the law. It's clearly written in the law in multiple places. So he tells them, all right, well, go ahead, but let's follow the law exactly as it states, which in cases like this of the law that required death as the punishment, the law stated that there needs to be witnesses to the crime, and the witnesses would actually start the stoning, but only if they were fully innocent of the crime. And then Jesus goes back to writing on the ground. So let's read on, see what happens next. Verse 9 says this, at this, those who had heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. And Jesus straightens up, gets done writing on the ground, and he asks her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. So the strangest thing happens, right? These self-righteous Pharisees who claim to follow the law flawlessly, the good kids, right? Jesus made them realize that they really aren't as righteous as they think. Jesus helps them to see that they're actually sinners too. And this isn't how they would want to be treated if someone caught them in their sin. And one by one, they start to leave, starting with the oldest. And it's kind of weird if you're reading that for the first time. You're like, well, why is that, mentioned? Because if any of us can tell you, go talk to a leader tonight. Some of us are older than others. We can tell you that the longer you live, the more you realize just how much you've gotten wrong and how much you need that forgiveness. So finally, it's only Jesus and the woman left, right? Jesus has successfully taken the focus off of the woman, off of her shame. He's protected her from being used in this plan to take him down in front of the people, and it's just the two of them. So go back to verse 10 and notice again Jesus' words and what he says to her. So it's just the two of them there. He straightens up, says, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir. And then look at this. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. So it's interesting. Notice what Jesus says and what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, it's fine, it's just human nature. You couldn't control yourself. It's cool. I get it. I understand. He doesn't say that what she did wasn't wrong. That's not what I don't condemn you means, right? Jesus is saying, I'm not going to condemn you. I'm not going to pronounce condemnation on you. I'm not going to call for the punishment that was set in the law. Because he's actually looking forward to a time not too long from now, maybe in a couple of weeks from when this happens, that he's going to die on the cross for all the sins of the world, including this one right here. So Jesus doesn't diminish what she did and say it's okay. We'll just act like it never happened. Instead, he says, No, because sin is sin, no matter what. That's what he was showing the Pharisees, right? Their sin is just as much of a sin as this woman was caught in adultery. Because sin is active rebellion against God and his plans for our life. And sin, as I was talking about a couple of weeks ago, it can't be overlooked. That's why Jesus had to come in the first place. That's why he's here, right? To deal with our sin problem. So look what Jesus says after he says, I don't condemn you. He tells her, go and leave your life of sin. So he doesn't just see her as a person and have compassion on her, but he sees her also as a sinner, and he directly tells her to repent and leave this lifestyle. So through this passage, we get this great view of how does he react to sinners? The big thing is he sees them as people who need him. He doesn't overlook the sin, but through his work on the cross, he offers her forgiveness and a way to pay for that sin. Let's look at another example in the Bible about how Jesus responds to sinners. This is seen, really clearly in several places about how Jesus acts towards a class of people in the Bible that are called tax collectors. So first off, any of you got jobs? Who out there's got a job, right? Have you ever, do you remember getting that first paycheck and you look at it and you see that somebody has taken money out of my paycheck? Have y'all seen that? Yes. Welcome to the world of work. The good thing is you're actually going to get most of that back since you probably don't make enough to really pay taxes. But so we've got some idea about the IRS, right? The Internal Revenue Service, right? And you might think, no one likes them. So maybe that's why people hate tax collectors in the Bible. But it's much more than that. So we may not like the IRS, but at least it's run by our own government, right? And the money they collect mostly goes towards running our country in ways that will directly benefit you. But you see, in first century Judea, the Romans had invaded and taken over. And they, as they did in all the places that they conquered, they collected taxes from the local people who they'd conquered to fund and upkeep the Roman Empire. And almost all of that money went back to Rome. And how they did this, how they collected these taxes, was by enlisting members of the local community to do the job of collecting the taxes. So as a Jewish tax collector then, you'd be seen by your fellow people as a traitor, right? Because you were actively supporting the very people who had conquered you and were oppressing you on a daily basis. You were helping them. So you looked at as a traitor. And because of that, then, these tax collectors were outcasts, right? They were hated and ostracized by their neighbors and the rest of the Jewish community. They were even disowned by their own families. They would have no friends except other tax collectors, people doing the same job, or other people that were just as despised by the general society, like criminals, prostitutes. That's the only people you could be friends with. If you want a good representation of this, watch the Chosen series and look at Matthew's story in this. So, tax collectors were traitors and outcasts, but it was even more than that. Because you might be like, okay, that sounds terrible. Who would want to be a tax collector, right? Who's going to do this? Well, you see, they were rich, right? Because they were in this position. How tax collecting worked in the Roman Empire was that Rome would allow the tax collectors to determine how much taxes the people owed. And they could actually charge them more taxes than they really owed Rome and then keep the rest as their payment. So they were traitors, they were outcasts, and they were thieves or cheaters. They basically stole from their very own neighbors to support their own lavish lifestyles. And even though the people knew they were being cheated, they couldn't do anything about it because the tax collectors were backed and protected by Rome and the Roman soldiers. All right, so now that we got an understanding of tax collectors, let's look at a good and a bad reaction to them in the Bible. So in Matthew chapter 9, we see Matthew's story. Matthew was a tax collector. Let's look at this. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector booth. "Follow me," he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And on hearing this, Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." So first, let's look at how the Pharisees treated the tax collectors, right? They asked his disciples, "Why is Jesus eating with him? Why is he eating with tax collectors and sinners?" Right? And today, we can kind of get an understanding of this. Eating with someone at their house is a very high act of friendship. You invite someone over to eat at your house, it's like a level of intimacy. And in first century Jewish culture, it was even more important to them than it is to us to eat with someone in their house. So devout Jews, like the Pharisees, would never be caught dead being friendly with a traitor and a thief like a tax collector, much less the other sinners that they were hanging out with. So when Jesus hears this question, he's like, "Yeah, of course I'm hanging out with sinners." Right? Because he tells him, who do you think needs salvation? Right? Sinners or righteous people? Who needs a doctor, he says? People that are healthy or people that are sick? And after Jesus reaches out to this tax collector called Matthew, his entire life changes, right? We see in this passage, it happens really quickly, but this is a massive life change for him. He drops everything. That means his lavish lifestyle. He was super rich. He was the only disciple that was actually rich that follows Jesus. He left more behind than anyone else and follows Jesus. He becomes one of Jesus' 12 disciples, eventually one of the 12 apostles, and he writes one of the 4 gospels in the Bible, the Gospel of Matthew that we were just reading from. So we see this was such a common occurrence for how Jesus treated tax collectors that one of the biggest complaints that the religious leaders had about Jesus, they would say, "He's a friend of tax collectors and sinners." Luke 7 tells us that. So when we ask ourselves, what would Jesus do when it comes to outcasts and sinners? The answer is clear from the Bible. He would seek them out. So I don't want to get us the wrong idea here. This doesn't mean that I'm saying, or that the Bible's saying, you should drop all your Christian friends, right? And start only hanging out with the bad kids. There's plenty of verses in the Bible about how who you associate with has a big impact on how you live, right? And about how you're not to be conformed to the pattern of this world, but to be transformed. And we know that's not what he means, because we never see Jesus hanging out with tax collectors and sinners without having this huge impact on them. See, he was the influencer, not the other way around. He influenced them. But as we start to wrap up, and Tillman, you can go ahead and come up. What I'm telling you to do tonight is to not treat these people like the Pharisees did. I want you to see these sinners as Jesus did. as people who need salvation. Don't see them as the bad kids. See them as people who are acting bad because they don't know Jesus. If you treat them like the Pharisees did, how are they supposed to hear about Jesus? How will they know how to live? What will make them want to know more about Jesus unless you are showing them God's love and living an example for them to follow? So begin to ask yourself that question: what would Jesus do? When you see the bad kids this week and you have a chance to interact with them, what would Jesus do? We saw tonight, he would see them as people. Instead of making fun of them, he'd draw attention away from their shame. Instead of self-righteously looking down his nose at him to make comparisons to make myself feel good, he'd see them as people who needed him. Jesus would get into a relationship with them in order to influence them for good. He wouldn't overlook their sin or join in it, but he'd give them the answer, the only answer to their sin. So what does that look like for you tonight? When you meet sinners this week, I want you to ask yourself, what would Jesus do? We see the answer tonight is that he would seek out the lost. Dear God, I thank you for this challenging message.